Hey, everybody. So with all of the drama occurring right now, with what has really become a scandal regarding President Biden's performance at the debate and the interview, some people calling for him to step aside to allow the nominating process to open up, some people saying we should stay with the president for this. But I think one thing that's happening with everyone is that people are seeing there's something bigger going on here. And I'm glad that people are, because I've certainly, as a candidate, seen a lot over the last year and a half. Something is being exposed here. It's not just about one candidate or one candidacy. It's about the system and how it operates. Also, I think people are asking questions about the power of political parties. Where does this come from? Political parties are not mentioned in the Constitution. How did they become such powerful gatekeepers? And given that they are such powerful gatekeepers, shouldn't we know more about how they operate, what their rules are, and what are they doing or not doing to make it actually more difficult for us to have a robust practice of democracy? So that's what we're doing here today. And my guest is Larry Taylor. Now, let me tell you something about Larry Taylor and why I thought he'd be a good person for us to talk to. He is president and founder of People for Democratic Party Reform. He's been an activist within the Democratic Party since 1996. He's held multiple positions within the Democratic Party, including Multnomah and Clatsop County chairs for a total of 14 years. He served on the Rules Committee of the Oregon Democratic Party. He chaired the Elections Integrity Caucus and founded the Small Business Caucus in Oregon. He serves as parliamentarian to unions and other organizations across the U.S. And I think also, Larry, you told me you were a delegate for Bernie Sanders in 2016. Is that what you told me?
Yes, I went to the previous three conventions in 2012, 2016, and 2020.
So obviously, as I said, a lot of people have a lot of questions about what the rules are. People have questions about what's going to happen now, should the president step aside. But if you could kind of give us just a general view, your view, obviously, of what's happening within the Democratic Party and any kind of historical trajectory that you have seen. You've been an activist within the party since the late 90s. What have you seen?
Well, it's been an interesting journey seeing what's going on. So if you listen to the media, you hear the reporters talking about the Democratic National Committee taking direction from the White House. And so I decided to look into the bylaws of the DNC and understand what that relationship really was. And if you look at the bylaws, you see that there is no relationship between the White House and the DNC. The chair of the DNC should be an independent, impartial chair of the party and should remain neutral through all of this stuff, which, of course, we haven't seen that happen in quite some time. If you read the charter of the DNC, it's very aspirational, and it talks about governing from the bottom. Article 1, Section 4 says, establish standards and rules of procedure to afford all members of the Democratic Party full, timely, and equal opportunities to participate in decisions concerning the selection of candidates, the formulation of policy, and the conduct of other party affairs. Very, very high-minded. But then
you get a big guffaw from me on that, Larry.
And then you look into the bylaws and you find all of these ways in which they have circumvented the participation in anything that even resembles a democratic process.
Hello. So when did this begin to happen?
I don't know when it began. It's an old political party, and I think they just evolved into a state where they've forgotten that they are supposed to be a democracy. In a democratically run organization, you have a neutral chair, and the chair's responsibility is to follow the will of the body, and yet what we see in the DNC is basically a corporate structure which is run by a huge DNC staff in the background. And so all of the members of the DNC attend meetings, but to them it's more like going to a movie and watching things happen instead of being participatory. And when I used to be a DNC member, and I was surprised because no one ever told me what my role was. And I would go to these meetings and I would sit through them, and no one would ask me to do anything. And so that's the other thing that I started investigating is, what is my role in the party and what should I be doing?
So you mentioned that when you actually read the aspirational description of the relationship between the White House and the DNC, that theoretically there isn't one. Is it your belief that over the last few years there has become not only a relationship between the White House and or whomever their preferred candidate is and the DNC beyond what is appropriate?
Oh, yeah. And Jamie Harrison, the chair of the DNC, is very clear about that. He says that his role is to reelect Joe Biden as president.
I
And he
remember
takes
hearing,
orders from the White House.
yes, it was really stunning when I first announced my candidacy, and I heard him say that. I remember I was in South Carolina. I was at the airport. I just landed. I can't remember what city, and I heard that. I don't know if I don't know where I heard it, but I was listening, and I thought, oh my God, they're not even pretending anymore. Because when I was young, the political party stands in the background. The voters decide who the nominee will be. At that point, the political party comes forward. Now, we were all very clear in 2016 that that's not what happened regarding Hillary and Bernie Sanders. I think most people are aware by now. Clearly, the DNC tipped the scales in favor of Hillary. After that election, some former Bernie supporters, perhaps you, I don't know, were part of a court case that was brought against the DNC for its lack of fairness, for its basic injustice towards Bernie. And the DNC won the case, saying that because they're not a government agency, they don't owe it to people to have a fair democratic process. Is that your understanding as well?
Yes.
Okay, so it's only gotten worse as the years have gone on since 2016, to the point where they're not even pretending, because they were pretending in 2016, or at least at the beginning. Whereas now, as you said, early in the process, they said, we see our job as helping to renominate the president. Now, as a candidate myself, my resentment was based, as a citizen, but certainly as a candidate, was based on the fact that they felt the entitlement not only to choose, but to create a lot of ruses around that choice to artificially create alignment, such as we don't primary an incumbent president, when in fact, I'm old enough to remember Lyndon Johnson, Eugene McCarthy primaried him. And that was very important because that really opened up a conversation about the end of the Vietnam War and led ultimately to Lyndon Johnson stepping aside. Also, people primary incumbent congresspeople and senators and mayors all the time. Also they created a ruse that anyone primarying the president is a spoiler, when in fact you can't be a spoiler in a primary. So is this how you see, from your perspective as well, kind of the shenanigans that go on and how they have taken for themselves control of the process in an undemocratic way?
Oh, yeah. And it's even worse. Not only do they go after challengers to incumbents, if you remember a couple of years ago, they would go after consultants who supported and they would blacklist consultants who worked for candidates running against incumbents. Now,
Oh,
there was such a stink about that, they stopped it. And so now that apparently people can get jobs again.
it's not only consultants, it's even vendors who were told in one way or another, you work for her, you won't work in this town again. You work for her, you can't work for us. In my experience, it was events that would be canceled, places that would not rent to me for events, and also infiltration, basically, of campaigns as well. So what do you think is the most important thing for us to know? Is it these big picture issues, or do we need to know some of the specific details that you talk about? How do we harness within the Democratic Party? Because a lot of people obviously are saying now, to hell with the duopoly. And listen, I have no criticism of third party candidates. I celebrate Bobby, I celebrate Jill, I celebrate anybody who participates. But I also celebrate those who feel moved to work within the parties. You know, a lot of what we're talking about is the same thing going on in the Republican Party too. I mean, I was listening to some woman on television the other day. So for those of us who feel that there's work to be done, like you feel, obviously, within the Democratic Party, what do we do?
Well, from my perspective, it's all based on the rules because we're a country based on the rule of law. And so what my organization did is that we examined the bylaws and found these anti-democratic anomalies that skews the system. If you remember the unity agreement from 2016 was kind of the opening of the door of that, where the superdelegates couldn't vote on the first round of voting. But they passed that as a resolution as opposed to actually modifying the bylaws. And so that got me to thinking about that process and what this would really look like if it was a representative democracy. If you look at all of the people who can vote at the convention, it's approaching 3,000 people. But there's only a subset of those who are elected from the states. And all of those other people are added in their voice, and it skews the representation. So it's not a one person, one vote kind of relationship. It's the skewed membership of all of these other people. So one of the things that we are proposing is that only the voting members, only the members of the DNC who are elected from the states get to vote. And all of these other people can attend the meetings, but we get back to a representational democracy inside the DNC and at the convention itself.
Okay, so what we're talking about here, of course, is the issue of the superdelegates. Am I right? Because aren't these
Superdelegates
small group of people that you're referring to? Isn't that the superdelegates?
Well, there's the superdelegates, and then there's all of these other people who are members by virtue of their elected positions. It's astonishing how many people have roles inside the party that are not elected by anybody.
So if I understood what you were saying, there's a large group of people that they're elected delegates, but then they do not have as much of a voice as a small unelected group. Is that correct?
Yes.
And is that small unelected group called superdelegates?
That's part of them. Inside the DNC itself, one of the things that the chair of the DNC can do is appoint 75 people to be DNC delegates on top of the 200 that are elected. And then there's this other people. So what you end up is a minority of elected people participating in the Democratic National Committee.
All right. Now let's go back just on the part that is the superdelegates. I was told that the whole superdelegate system occurred in response to the landslide victory of Richard Nixon over George McGovern, that there were forces within the Democratic Party who said, we'll never let that happen again. Is that your understanding, that that's how the superdelegate system got formed to begin with?
That sounds vaguely familiar. I can't remember the details, but that sounds accurate.
Okay, so then you're saying now, it's something I didn't know, that in addition to that, there are 75 sort of friends and family of the DNC that get to be those voting members as well.
Yes.
You know, I spoke to Bobby Kennedy when I told him that I plan to continue in the race. And he said to me something like, you know, the superdelegates will never let it happen, Marianne. And I said to him at the time, I said, you had the money and the name that you could go independent. Most of us, as difficult as it is, and the money that's involved, and all of the shenanigans that are perpetrated against you, most of us still, our best shot of really getting anywhere is working within an already established party. But what you're talking about here is the fact that, you know, and I understand why some people say, why even bother? It's impossible. But it just feels to me on a kind of emotional and moral level, you can't just give it up. That's why I admire you. So tell us, Captain, how are we going to break this? How are we going to disrupt this? Tell us what to do. You know,
Well,
I want
I
to
would
know.
I would go back. I would look at the rules of the DNC in terms of a democracy. Everyone says they love democracy, but I think when you really look underneath the sheets, people really don't like democracy because they just don't have control. Um, so first of all, we have to get representation inside the DNC where the people who get to vote are the ones that represent the people, not all of these other people who are hangers on.
But how do we even get the power to make that change?
Well, the rules committee, interestingly, one of the reasons why we wanted to participate in this convention is that you can actually change the bylaws of the DNC at the convention. And so we've written 5 resolutions to modify the DNC bylaws, and the hope was that those would be brought before the convention rules committee. They would be, in the fantasy world, they would be passed and they would be brought to the floor, and they would be accepted by the body because it's the right thing to do, and then we would clean up some of these messes. Now, I ran to be on the rules committee of the convention, and I came in last somehow. Out of 30 people who ran from California or from Oregon, I was the only one with a parliamentary background, and somehow I came in last. When I was at the 2016 Convention Rules Committee, I was very impressed because they allowed the Bernie people to bring up resolutions in the committee, and they would be debated. And of course, the Hillary people outnumbered the Bernie people, and so they were all voted down until we got to the Unity Commission report. But at that point in time, they were at least open to listening to these things. So another thing that needs to be fixed is the committees of the DNC where all of the work is done. And the primary one, of course, is the Rules Committee. All the members of the standing committees are appointed by the DNC chair, and there's no limit to the number of people that he can appoint to those committees, and there's no requirements for geographic distribution. So if you look at who sits on the Rules Committee, they're mostly people concentrated in the Washington, D.C. area. And it's a very cozy group of people, some of which I'm just horrified that they're on there. We had a chair of a state who got involved in a primary and did a smear campaign against a challenger to an incumbent in the House of Representatives. And after he left that role, he's now been appointed to the Rules Committee.
Well, they're very good at the smear thing. I can tell you that.
What we proposed is that we take the 4 geographic divisions of the United States, and that each of those divisions elect a certain number of members to the standing committees. So we get representation from the entire country. Like California is the most populous state in the United States, is barely represented on these committees.
How do we change this?
We need to elect people to the DNC who will basically modify the bylaws and get it back to the basic principles of democracy.
There are
some
really good people on the DNC.
There are some good people.
There are some really good people, and you hear stories. I remember when, I think it was Jim Zogby a couple of years ago, tried to make some changes and was so shouted down, and he talked about that. So do you think that people such as he are talking among themselves, DNC members who are realizing what's going on and trying to make these changes?
He is, but he was actually removed from the DNC. He used to be on the Rules Committee, and I believe he was removed from that. So they don't like dissent. They like people that are in agreement and rubber stamp. I don't know what back room the stuff gets drawn up. Every time they have an election for the DNC chair, they change the rules around how that process works. This last time, it was almost impossible for anyone to run for DNC chair because of the signature requirements. the time limits that they had to be submitted for them to be a candidate to run for DNC.
So to the person who's listening to this, a concerned person, whether they know for sure that they would consider themselves a Democrat or not, but are just open, what do you suggest specifically? What is the action item? How can people help, and what can people do? Because no matter what, no matter what, whether it's Green Party, Democratic Party, Republican Party, Independent, the corruption of these processes is bad for all of us. So tell us what people can do.
Many people hate the parties, and they get so poorly treated by the establishment that they walk away. And that's what has happened to so many of the Bernie Sanders supporters.
Right.
When Bernie Sanders dropped out in 2020, his people ran for the hills, and we have trouble getting the reformers to hang in there.
Right.
But people have to hold their nose. They have to get involved with the party, and they have to take over these positions. We have to elect delegates to the DNC to get these changes made.
You know, that's a big psychological issue right there. You know, I get such criticism from people. Oh, Marianne, you just don't understand how the duopoly works, and you're so naive, and why are you even trying to support that? First of all, how could you actually be in the position I've been in and continue to be naive on any level about any of this stuff? But what you just said is exactly how I've felt. That's exactly what they want, is for us to go away. You know, I'm old enough to remember a Democratic Party that had spine, that wasn't a culture of powerlessness, that wasn't a culture of whining, and that wasn't a culture of authoritarianism almost. It's a strain in our culture today. It's this corporatist toe the line, and toe the line, and we'll come after you if you don't toe the line. And I also think that that's one of the reasons why so many Democratic leaders in Washington today are saying, I'm with Joe, because they know what would happen to them if they said otherwise. But now they're being exposed, you know, for hypocrisy and cowardice. And it's so interesting. There was a quote all over the news yesterday from an anonymous state party leader saying, I'd say what I think is really going on surrounding this issue with Joe Biden, but they would crucify me. So I really appreciate what you're saying. The only thing is, I don't want people to leave this hearing this interview with like not knowing what they could possibly do to help. I did hear you say, stay in there, stay in the Democratic Party. But is there anything specific that people can do regarding, for instance, the convention this year to try to be part of the solution?
If we had someone who belonged to the Rules Committee and could bring our proposals before the committee, I think that it could be the beginning of the change. There's so many people who are well-intended, but they have no idea how biased and corrupt the system is. And so the only way to expose this is to bring these ideas out and to debate them and get them into circulation, so eventually we can act upon them.
Is there a place where people can read more of your ideas and your activities and things in order to follow up on this, Larry?
Yes, we have a website, of course. It's pdpr.org, People for Democratic Party Reform.org. And there's a tab that describes and has the actual language of the resolutions that can be brought before the Rules Committee and proposed. So if someone would like to do that, that would be just awesome. And we could get the discussion started.
So you heard it here, everybody. You know, the late John Lewis said, make good trouble. And I hear that phrase co-opted by people who are such guardians of the status quo, I can't even tell you. So we have to make sure that that idea, make good trouble, stays in the mouth and inscribed on the heart and in the hands of those of us who really understand what that means. Any system that is seeking to replace the messiness of democracy, the free-spiritedness of democracy, is not a support for democracy. So, Larry, thank you very much. Anything else you want to tell people?
When they go to that webpage, there's a join button, and we would appreciate it if they would join. So when we initiated this this organization, we had over 400 members, and we had representation from 42 states. Because of the disillusionment that has dropped off. But what we need to do is rebuild the movement so that we can all work together and affect these changes.
You got it. All right, everybody. We know what to do. Don't give up. Just don't give up. That's what they want us to do. They want to exhaust us. Don't be exhausted. This is our time. Thank you, Larry Taylor.
Thank you.
So appreciate you being here. Appreciate all of you, everyone. Rev up. This is the moment.